So having a further look at interpolation, as this is quite a hard and new topic for most pupils, we're going to have another look at interpolation, but we're going to look a little bit further at this, at how we can use interpolation to find the lower and upper quartile as well. So remember from GCSE that the lower quartile is the value of which 25% is less than that value, and the upper quartile is that which has 75% less than that value. So here we have the following table shows the marks obtained for mathematics in a certain group. So we can see here that we've got the marks, and here we have the frequencies, the number of pupils that gained marks within those intervals. So we're going to start off by having a look at the median like we did last time. It won't always be the median that you're asked to start off with, so please make sure that you do check that. Remember that we start off by adding a cumulative frequency column to our table. So at the end of this interval we have 10. At the end of the first two intervals put together, so from 10 to 30, we would have 28. At the end of the third interval, so from 10 to 40, we would have 58. Then from 10 to 50, that would be 68, just adding on the next value as we did before. 10 to 60, adding on 14, that would be 82. 10 to 70, that would be 98. And then 10 to 80, that would be 100. So remember, when we're finding the median, we need to do n plus 1 divided by 2. So in this case, that's going to be 100 plus 1 divided by 2, which gives us 50.5 piece of data. So then we're looking at our intervals and we're trying to find the one that has the 50.5th piece of data. Well, if we have a look here, at the end of the second interval we have 28 pieces of data, and at the end of the third interval we have 58 pieces of data. So that means that somewhere before the end of that third interval we have our median. So that is where we're going to look. So next we're going to draw our number line. So the value that we have at the beginning is 30, the value that we have at the end is 40, and somewhere in the middle there is our median value. We start off with 28 pieces of data, we end up with 58 pieces of data, and we're looking for the 50.5th piece of data. So now we're going to make our fractions. So we're going to have x minus 30 divided by 50.5 minus 28 equals 40 minus 30 divided by 58 minus 28, in the same way as we set up the fractions before. So then we're going to go to equation, solver, and now we're going to type it into here. You can just type over whatever you've already got in here. So we're going to have our fraction button, we're going to have x, so remember to use the x to t button here, minus 30, down to get onto the bottom of our fraction, divided by 50.5 minus 28, across to get out to the bottom of the fraction, shift in the decimal point for the equal sign, then fraction 40 minus 30, down to get onto the bottom of our divide, so divided by 58 minus 28. And remember that you have to click XE twice for it to come up with the answer. So our median value is 37.5. Now for our lower quartile, sorry about that message there. There we go. So for our lower quartile, we are still going to be doing n plus 1, but as I said before, because we're finding a quartile, we want a quarter of our data, so instead of dividing by 2, we're going to divide by 4 instead. So we're going to have 100 plus 1, this time divided by 4. So if I go back into my normal part of my calculator, you can always do it in here. So we've got 100 plus 1 divided by 4, which should give us 25 change it into a decimal using the SD button, 25.5. So we're looking for the 25.25, piece of data. So again, having a look at our cumulative frequency, at the end of the first interval we've got 10, at the end of the second interval we've got 28, so that's too far, which means that somewhere in that second interval is our lower quartile. So again, we're going to set up our number line. So that interval starts at 20 and ends at 30, and somewhere in there is our median. We have 10 pieces of data at the beginning, we have 28 by the end of that interval, and somewhere in there is our lower quartile, which is our 25th.25 piece of data. So then we set up the fractions in exactly the same way as we did when we were finding the median. So that's going to be x minus 20 divided by 25.25 minus 10 equals 30 minus 20 divided by 28 minus 10. And again, we go into the equation solver and we can just type over this again. So x theta t for our x minus 20 down onto the bottom of our fraction divided by 25.25 minus 10 across to get out of the fraction, shifting the decimal point for the equals, fraction button again, 30 minus 20 divided by 28 minus 10. And remember again that you have to click the XE button twice. And also in statistics, we round things to 3 significant figures where applicable, unless told otherwise. So in this case, our lower quartile is going to be 28.5 to 3 significant figures. Lastly, we're going to have a look at how we would do this for the upper quartile. So this time, it's like the lower quartile, n plus 1 divided by 4. But remember that that gives us the value that has 25% of the data less than the value. We want it so it's got 75% of the data less than that value. So we're then going to times that by 3. Because if we times it by 2, we would get our median. When we times it by 3, we end up with our upper quartile. So that means that we're going to have 100 plus 1 divided by 4, and then that whole thing times by 3. And when you put that into your calculator, you should end up with 75.75 piece of data. So again, having a look back at our cumulative frequency that we added onto our table, we can see here that this 40 to 50 interval gives us 68 pieces of data by the end, and the next interval goes from 50 to 60 and that has 82 pieces of data by the end of it, which is too far. We want the 75.75 piece of data, so it's going to be somewhere in this interval that our upper quartile lies. So again, we need to draw our number line. So that interval starts at 50, it ends at 60, and somewhere in the middle there is our median. We have 68 pieces of data at the beginning, we have 82 pieces of data by the end of that interval, and we're looking for the 75.75 piece of data. So again, we draw our fractions, so that's x minus 50 divided by 75.75 minus 68 equals 60 minus 50 divided by 82 minus 68. And again, we can put it into here. Just start typing. If you click exit, it'll come up like this, and then you can click up to get back to this part. So fraction button, x theta t for the x, minus 50 divided by, so click down, 75.75 minus 68 across to get out of the divide sign equals fraction 60 minus 50 down to get onto the bottom of the divide side, 82 minus 68, click XE twice, and there we go. So our estimate for the upper quartile is going to be 55.5, and remember again that that is to 3 significant figures. Now, the reason that these are only estimates is that we're still not 100% sure of how the data is going to be distributed within these intervals. All of the data could be at the bottom of these intervals, and in which case our values would be off. But if we're assuming that the data is equally spread within the intervals, then these are going to be better estimates of the median, lower quartile and upper quartile than just given the generic interval that it lies within. So I'd now like you to pause the video and give the Now You try a go. Remember that this time our data is going across, so when we are doing our cumulative frequency, I'm just going to help you with that before I want you to pause the video. At the end of this first interval we have 10. At the end of the next interval we have the 10 and the 13, which gives us 23. At the end of the next interval, we have the 10, the 13 and the 28, so that gives us 51. At the end of the next interval, that would get us up to 66, and at the end of the end interval, that would get us up to 75. And quite nicely this time in the question, they have told us that there were 75 parcels that were being looked at the post office, so that means that we have done our cumulative frequency correctly. So I would now like you to pause the video and have a try at finding the estimate for the median, the lower quartile and the upper quartile for the weights of these parcels. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video and you gave the Now You try a go. So this time we had 75 pieces of data, so 75 plus 1 divided by 2 means that our median piece of data is going to be the 38th piece of data. We can see that that's going to lie in this interval here where I've coloured it in yellow, because that one ends at 23, this one ends at 51, so somewhere in here is going to be our median value. Then I drew my number line going from 20 to 30 with our median in the middle. We start off with 23 pieces of data, we end up with 51 pieces of data, and we're looking for the 38th piece of data. Then I made my fractions, I put them into the solver part of my calculator, and that gave me 25.4 to 3 significant figures. Then for the lower quartile, remember that's n plus 1 divided by 4, so that's going to be 75 plus 1 divided by 4, which means that our lower quartile is going to be the 19th piece of data. Here I've coloured that in green, because we can see that that interval there ends at 10, this one ends at 23, so somewhere in that interval is going to be the 19th piece of data. So that interval starts at 10, ends at 20, and somewhere in there is our lower quartile. We start off with 10 pieces of data, we end up with 23 pieces of data, and I'm looking for the 19th piece of data. Then we create our fractions and we end up with 16.9 to 3 significant figures when we put it into the equation solver part of our calculator. Lastly, when we have a look at the upper quartile, so this time we're doing n plus 1 divided by 4 and then times by 3. So 75 plus 1 divided by 4 times 3 gives us 57, so we're looking for the 57th piece of data for our upper quartile. And you can see here that I've coloured that in blue. That interval there ends at 51, this one ends at 66, so somewhere in there is my upper quartile. So again, I've drawn a number line. I start the interval at 30, the interval ends at 40, and somewhere in there is my upper quartile. The interval before that ends at 51, this interval ends at 66, and we're looking for the 57th piece of data for our upper quartile. So making our fractions from that and entering that into the equation solver part of our calculator, you can still see that one here, gives us exactly 34. So I haven't wrote that this one is rounded to 3 significant figures because this time it gave us a whole number answer. So just a couple of things to point out, that we can always do a little bit of a check of if our answer makes sense. I knew here that my median was going to be somewhere between 20 and 30, and it was, it gave us 25.4. I knew that my lower quartile was going to be somewhere between 10 and 20, and it was, it gave me 16.9 and so on. But also we can have a double check as well, that these values do make sense. The lower quartile is smaller than the median, which is smaller than the upper quartile. And don't be thrown off if sometimes you find that 2 or even all of these are actually within the same interval. Because the piece of data that we will be looking at will be different in each case, whether it's the median, the lower quartile or the upper quartile, that means that the eventual answer that we get from doing our number line and making our fractions and putting it into solver will give us a different value. But just be careful with that. You can have more than one in the same interval that you are trying to find it in. Thank you very much for listening.